The alarm in the emergency ward echoed like a desperate scream, and Dr. Michael Carter's heart pounded as he rushed through the pristine white corridors of St. John's Medical Center. His coat was crisp, his stethoscope swung against his chest, yet whispers trailed behind him like shadows. "That's him," a nurse muttered under her breath. "The new guy. Doesn't look like he belongs here." He had heard it all before, but tonight was different. Tonight chaos had erupted, and people who once doubted him were now screaming for help. The irony was brutal, but Michael had no time to think. Lives were hanging by a thread. As he entered the trauma bay, the smell of burnt metal and gasoline invaded the room. A mass accident had flooded the ER with patients. Among them, Michael instantly recognized the faces of Dr. William Harris, the senior surgeon who openly mocked his skills, and Claire Evans, the head nurse who once told a patient not to worry because the real doctor would arrive soon. Now both of them were pale, terrified, and injured, sitting on stretchers. Their eyes locked with his, and Michael saw the flicker of disbelief, almost as if fate itself had orchestrated this cruel reversal. "Dr. Carter, we need hands now," shouted Dr. Patel, the attending on call, tossing gloves at him. The urgency left no space for hesitation, but Michael caught the glance of another intern smirking in the corner. "Let's see if he doesn't mess this up," the intern muttered. The words sliced deeper than the chaos around them. For months, Michael had endured doubts, humiliation, and quiet exclusion in every meeting and procedure. Tonight, in the middle of fire and blood, he was about to prove not only his place but also his worth. His hands trembled for a fraction of a second before instinct took over. He pressed against the bleeding wound of a young girl, his voice firm and commanding. "I need suction here now," he barked, and the room froze at his tone. Authority rolled off his voice, surprising even himself. For the first time, no one questioned him, not because they respected him, but because there was no other choice. The patients were too many, the injuries too severe, and survival depended on his clarity under fire. The irony wasn't lost on him. All those weeks, Michael had walked these halls invisible, dismissed, and sometimes openly laughed at. In conference rooms, he had been interrupted mid-sentence. In surgeries, his suggestions had been brushed aside. In the cafeteria, whispers floated about how he must have gotten in through diversity quotas. Yet now, in the blood-soaked chaos of the ER, those same voices turned desperate, pleading for his guidance. It was a cruel twist, one he never asked for, but one he was forced to face. Claire Evans groaned as orderlies pushed her stretcher closer. Her leg was mangled, glass shards embedded in her skin, and her face was pale with shock. "Dr. Carter?" she whispered, her voice trembling with both pain and disbelief. It was the first time she had called him by his title without sarcasm. Michael didn't respond. He simply checked her vitals, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here for vindication. He was here because she might die if he didn't act fast. On the far side of the bay, Dr. Harris clutched his chest, his breathing shallow. The man who once laughed in his face during rounds was now staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Carter, do something," Harris gasped. The arrogance that once dripped from his tone was gone, replaced by naked fear. Michael felt a storm raging inside, part anger, part vindication, part cold professionalism. He had waited his whole life to stand in this room, in this moment, and no prejudice could rob him of the doctor he had become. The beeping monitors and frantic cries blurred around him as he took command. "We need to stabilize him before cardiac arrest," Michael ordered. Nurses scrambled, not daring to question him now. For a fleeting second, he caught sight of his reflection on the polished cabinet door. Sweat dripping, eyes sharp, posture unyielding. This was the doctor he had trained to be, yet deep down he knew that no matter how many lives he saved tonight, prejudice wouldn't vanish overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it would leave a scar on those who had underestimated him. As he stitched wounds, inserted IVs, and issued orders, Michael's mind replayed the countless humiliations. Patients who refused his care, colleagues who mocked his pronunciation, administrators who double-checked his credentials as if he had sneaked into the hospital. Each memory burned, but instead of breaking him, it fueled every move. Every stitch was a statement. Every command was defiance. Every life he pulled back from death was proof that competence had no color. The chaos seemed endless. Sirens wailed outside as more stretchers poured in. The ER floor glistened with blood. Gloves snapped, machines beeped in overlapping rhythm. In the middle of it all, Michael stood tall, sweat soaking his collar. his voice cutting through the noise with precision. Nobody dared question him now. The weight of survival had silenced prejudice, at least for this night. But deep down, Michael knew this was only the beginning of a storm he would face again and again. The faces of Harris and Claire burned into his memory. These weren't just colleagues. They were symbols of everything he had endured. The whispers, the laughter, the subtle daggers of doubt. Now fate had placed their lives in his hands. The cruel poetry of it all made his chest tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. If he let anger guide him, he would fail them. And failure was the one thing he could never allow. In that moment, standing over the bleeding bodies of those who once belittled him, Michael Carter understood the cruel balance of justice. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here because he had sworn an oath. Yet the fire in his chest whispered something else, that no matter how much he gave, they might still see him as less. And still he chose to fight for them, because that's what real doctors did. And tonight, he was about to show the entire hospital the true meaning of that title. The night stretched into a blur of sirens and alarms, and Michael could feel the weight of countless eyes pressing on him. Every command he gave was followed, every action executed, but the silence behind it was heavy. No words of encouragement, no nods of respect. They obeyed because they had no choice, not because they believed in him. He noticed it in the stiff movements of the nurses, the way some avoided his gaze, the hesitation before handing him tools. Prejudice doesn't vanish under pressure. It merely hides behind necessity, and Michael could feel it lurking, waiting to strike again once the chaos faded. As he worked, the memory of his first day at St. John's clawed its way into his mind. He had walked into the hospital with hope in his chest, believing talent and training would earn him a place among equals. Instead, he was greeted with skepticism. Dr. Harris had smirked, shaking his head as though the hospital had lowered its standards. "We're running out of real doctors, I see," Harris had said, the room filling with nervous laughter. Michael had smiled politely, swallowing his rage. Now, seeing Harris gasping on a stretcher, Michael almost felt that same laughter echoing around him. Mocking, cruel, unforgettable. Claire Evans had been no better. She made sure to remind him of his place with subtle digs in front of patients. "Dr. Carter will take your information and then Dr. Harris will handle the real work," she would say, loud enough for everyone to hear. Patients followed her cues, some refusing his care until a white doctor stepped in. He had carried those wounds silently, pressing forward, determined to prove himself. Yet tonight the irony was bitter. She was the one lying broken, and he was the only one standing between her and death. The reversal was almost too sharp to process. The prejudice extended beyond staff. Just last week, Michael had been assigned to a wealthy patient, Mr. Donovan, who looked him up and down with thinly veiled contempt. "You're the doctor?" Donovan had scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I'll wait for someone more qualified." The sting of those words followed him like a phantom. Tonight, Donovan's wife was among the injured, her fragile body trembling as Michael worked quickly to stabilize her. The irony was brutal. Her life now depended on the very man her husband had rejected. Justice had a cruel sense of timing. The trauma bay had turned into a battlefield, and Michael was its reluctant commander. The interns who once ignored him now clung to his every instruction. Still, the glances they exchanged spoke volumes. They didn't trust him. They feared failure more than they doubted him. That was the difference. Survival outweighed bias, but only for now. He could almost hear their inner voices. If he makes one mistake, we'll never let him forget it. The pressure wasn't just about saving lives. It was about fighting against the invisible jury watching his every move, waiting for him to fail. The air was thick with blood and tension. Michael's gloves were slick. His gown stained crimson, yet his hands moved with precision. Each life saved was another weight lifted, but also another reminder of the impossible standard placed upon him. For his colleagues, failure was human. For him, failure would be confirmation of every cruel whisper, every smirk, every doubt. He had to be flawless. Perfection wasn't a goal, it was survival. And tonight, surrounded by broken bodies and burning stairs, he carried the crushing truth of that expectation. The more he worked, the more memories flooded in. The late-night study sessions, the sacrifices, the countless times he had been told medicine wasn't for people like him. teachers who underestimated him, classmates who dismissed him, patients who refused him. He had bled for this career, carved his path through resistance thicker than walls of steel. And now, in the heat of this crisis, he felt all of that history pressing against him. This wasn't just another night in the ER. This was every insult, every humiliation, every prejudice crashing into a single defining storm. Even as he saved lives, the hostility never fully faded. A nurse hesitated before handing him a scalpel, her eyes flickering with doubt. "Are you sure about this, doctor?" she whispered, her tone laced with skepticism. Michael froze for half a second, staring at her, then replied sharply, "Yes, and if you hesitate again, she dies." The nurse flinched, her cheeks flushing with shame before obeying. The words hung heavy in the air, proof that even in chaos, doubt followed him like a shadow, creeping into every moment, poisoning every breath. Dr. Patel noticed it too, his brows furrowing as he watched Michael lead. Patel had never openly mocked him, but his silence during the countless humiliations had been just as cruel. Now Patel's eyes shifted between admiration and something else, unease, maybe even guilt. Michael could feel it. For the first time, Patel saw him not as a token hire, but as a man carrying the room on his shoulders. Still, Patel said nothing. Not a word of support, not a nod of acknowledgement. Silence was safer. Silence kept the hierarchy intact. The patients' families huddled in the waiting area, their faces pale with grief and fear. Some recognized Michael, whispering his name with disbelief. "Is he the one treating them?" one woman asked, her tone skeptical. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. Murmurs spread like wildfire, doubt contaminating the air. Even as he fought to save lives, prejudice leaked through walls and doors, unrelenting. Michael didn't hear the words, but he felt them, like a cold wind against his back. It was a reminder. His battle wasn't just against blood loss and trauma. It was against centuries of bias carved into stone. The weight of it all pressed on him like a crushing tide, but Michael refused to falter. Every stitch, every bandage, every order was an act of rebellion, a declaration that he belonged here despite everything. Yet deep down, a darker thought lingered. Would it even matter? Once the crisis ended, would the whispers return, sharper than ever? Would Harris and Claire go back to mocking him once they healed? The thought twisted in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about tomorrow. Tonight was about survival, and survival alone. As the minutes dragged on, exhaustion gnawed at him, but he couldn't slow down. The monitors beeped in chaotic rhythm, alarms shrieked, and lives dangled on the edge. In the center of it all, Michael Carter stood unshaken. He wasn't just fighting for the patients in front of him. He was fighting for every moment of dignity stolen from him, for every sneer, every doubt. The battle was bigger than the ER. It was bigger than the hospital. Tonight, Michael wasn't just a doctor. He was a man waging war against the very foundation of prejudice, and the outcome would change everything. The chaos finally began to subside as dawn crept into the hospital corridors. Painting the sterile walls with pale light, Michael stood in the ER exhausted, his gloves stained and his body aching from hours of relentless work. The room smelled of antiseptic and iron, yet what lingered most was silence. The patients he had fought to save were stabilized, but the gratitude he expected never came. Nurses avoided his eyes. Colleagues whispered in corners. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, only the cold hum of machines. The weight of invisibility settled on his shoulders, heavier than fatigue. Dr. Harris was wheeled away to the ICU, his condition stable thanks to Michael's quick intervention. Yet as the stretcher rolled past, Harris didn't utter a word of thanks. His lips pressed into a tight line, his eyes sliding away as though acknowledging Michael's role would be too bitter a pill to swallow. The irony burned Michael's chest. He had saved the life of a man who had laughed at his very presence, but instead of gratitude, he was met with silence. Silence that screamed louder than words. Silence that cut like glass. Claire Evans was no different. Her mangled leg had been treated under Michael's steady hands, but when she regained consciousness, she looked at him with something resembling shame, though she disguised it quickly. "Thank you, doctor," she muttered, her voice mechanical, stripped of sincerity. Michael nodded, but the hollowness of her words echoed in his head. It wasn't respect. It wasn't acknowledgement. It was obligation, forced by circumstance. And once she healed, he knew the old sarcasm would return like a wound reopened. The cycle never truly ended. Even in the staff room where doctors gathered to debrief after the catastrophe, Michael found himself isolated. Laughter bubbled as they recounted moments of chaos, bonding through shared trauma. Yet when Michael entered, the air shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes flickered away, and the invisible wall rose again. He poured himself a cup of stale coffee, his hands trembling slightly, but no one invited him into the circle. They had fought alongside him, followed his orders, relied on his steadiness, but now, in the quiet aftermath, they retreated back to their fortress of exclusion. Sitting alone at a corner table, Michael listened to the muted voices around him. They praised Patel's quick decisions, admired the intern's composure, applauded the nurse's dedication. His name was absent. He was erased from the narrative as if he hadn't been the backbone holding the ER together. Each omission was a dagger, twisting deeper into his chest. He clenched his jaw, his coffee growing cold, his eyes fixed on the floor. The loneliness was suffocating, a reminder that brilliance wasn't enough to break walls built on prejudice. The weight of exhaustion pulled him deeper into despair. He thought of his mother, who had always told him, "You'll have to be twice as good, Michael, just to be seen as equal." Her words rang truer than ever. He had given everything, every ounce of knowledge, every drop of strength, and still he was invisible. Still he was unwanted. The sacrifice felt endless, the reward non-existent. He questioned whether this fight was worth it, whether medicine was a battlefield where victory was even possible for someone like him. Later that evening, as he walked to his car, the city outside the hospital was waking to another day. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried, the world moved on, unaware of the storm he had endured. He sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, staring at the hospital entrance in the rearview mirror. Inside, people were alive because of him. Families would go home with loved ones because of him, yet he drove away with nothing but bitterness in his chest. His value measured not in gratitude but in denial. It was as if saving lives still wasn't enough. The loneliness followed him home like an unshakable shadow. His apartment was quiet, the walls bare, his phone silent. No calls from colleagues checking in, no invitations to decompress together. He collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the night. The screams, the blood, the doubt, the silence. Each memory twisted into another reminder that he was not part of them, never fully accepted. He had fought death itself, but the greater battle, the battle for belonging, remained unwinnable. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of voices laughing, whispering, mocking. He saw Harris sneering, Claire rolling her eyes, Patience turning away. He woke in a sweat, his chest tight, his heart racing. The fear wasn't of failing medically. It was of being invisible forever, of fighting a war where victories were erased and losses magnified. The isolation seeped into his bones, draining his will, suffocating his spirit. He wondered if one day it would break him entirely, leaving nothing but exhaustion and silence behind. The next morning, he returned to St. John's, his white coat crisp, his face composed, his mask of professionalism firmly in place. The halls were alive with chatter, but none directed toward him. Nurses greeted Patel warmly. Interns clustered around Harris, already calling him a survivor. Michael walked past, unseen, unacknowledged, his presence like a shadow on the wall. He forced himself to keep moving, his jaw tight, his chest heavy. The isolation was no longer just in his head. It was in every step, every look, every silence. Even patients played their part. A woman waiting for treatment glanced up as Michael approached, then whispered to her husband, who frowned. "Can't we wait for another doctor?" she murmured, her eyes sliding away. Michael froze for a second before forcing a polite smile. "I'll take good care of you," he said softly, though the words tasted like ash. He turned to wash his hands, his reflection in the mirror fractured by fluorescent light. The man staring back at him was capable, intelligent, determined. Yet behind his eyes was a loneliness no medicine could cure. By the end of the day, Michael sat once more in the break room, alone. The walls closed in, the air heavy with silence. He had fought harder than anyone, endured more than most, but acceptance still felt out of reach. The fight wasn't against ignorance alone. It was against his suffering. Wasn't just the weight of one night. It was the culmination of years of silent battles, each one carving away at his spirit. The hospital board meeting was supposed to be a routine discussion about the night of the accident, but Michael felt the tension the moment he entered the conference room. Senior doctors filled the seats, their suits immaculate, their expressions sharp. At the head of the table sat Dr. Harris, his chest still weak from the injuries Michael had treated, but his arrogance fully restored. "Let's begin," Harris said, his voice commanding. Michael stood at the back, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. He was invisible once again, despite being the very reason Harris was alive. As the discussion unfolded, Harris praised the team's effort, highlighting Patel's leadership, Claire's dedication, even the intern's bravery. Each name was spoken with pride, each face beaming with validation. But when it came to Michael, Harris's tone shifted. "And of course," he said with a dry smile, "Dr. Carter assisted where he could. Though still inexperienced, he did his best." The room chuckled softly, the words sinking like poison into Michael's chest. Assisted, he had led, he had commanded. He had saved Harris's life. Yet his role was diminished to a footnote. Michael's hands curled into fists under the table. He wanted to speak, to demand recognition, but the weight of every stare pressed down on him. To them, his voice was an intrusion, not a contribution. Harris continued, "We must remember experience matters in crises. Improvisation can be dangerous." The words were sharp, a veiled jab dressed as wisdom. The hypocrisy stung. Michael's improvisation had been the only reason Harris and others had survived. Yet here he was, painted as a risk rather than a savior. The injustice gnawed at him, raw and merciless. Claire, her legs still in a cast, added to the humiliation. "It's true," she said, her tone cool. "There were moments where I feared things were spiraling. Luckily, Dr. Patel kept things steady." Her words twisted the knife deeper. Michael had been the one shouting orders, controlling the chaos, stitching wounds with precision. Yet the credit slid past him like water, flowing into hands that had done far less. The room nodded in agreement, the narrative rewritten before his eyes. Truth drowned beneath prejudice, smothered without remorse. The final blow came when the hospital director, Mr. Langston, spoke. His voice was calm, authoritative, polished. "We appreciate everyone's efforts, but we must also be mindful of public image." Several families expressed concern when Dr. Carter was the one treating them. They were uncomfortable. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Concerned, uncomfortable. His competence erased by skin color, reduced to whispers of doubt from frightened relatives. Michael's jaw tightened, his throat dry, his heart sinking into a pit of helpless rage. The message was clear. No matter how skilled, he would always be a liability in their eyes. The room fell silent as Langston delivered the verdict. "For the sake of our reputation, Dr. Carter will be reassigned to administrative duties for the next few months. It will give him time to learn and grow." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Michael's chest burned, his vision blurred. Reassigned? Demoted under the guise of mentorship? After everything he had given, after every life he had saved, they were pushing him aside. His career, his pride, his dignity, shattered in a single calculated decision. He wanted to scream, but the walls held his silence captive. The humiliation was complete when Harris leaned back in his chair, smirking. "It's for the best," he said casually. "We can't risk improvisation in high-stakes medicine. Patients deserve certainty." The hypocrisy was unbearable. Certainty had nearly killed Harris. Improvisation had saved him. And yet, in front of everyone, Harris painted himself as the wise mentor and Michael as the reckless novice. Laughter rippled around the table, soft but sharp like knives slicing flesh. Michael stood frozen, his body screaming to move, but his pride anchoring him in place. When the meeting ended, colleagues passed by without meeting his eyes. Some muttered, "Tough break," but their words were hollow, their sympathy performative. Others avoided him entirely, as if his humiliation was contagious. Claire limped past, offering a tight smile that carried no warmth. Harris patted his shoulder lightly, a mockery disguised as camaraderie. "Keep working hard, Carter. One day you'll get there." Michael flinched at the touch, his skin crawling, his chest burning with rage and despair. It wasn't encouragement. It was a performance, staged cruelty hidden behind polite tones. Walking out of the conference room, Michael felt the eyes of interns and nurses trailing him. Whispers followed him down the hall, feeding on his humiliation. "Did you hear?" They sidelined him. Guess he wasn't ready after all. Knew it was too soon. Their voices stabbed him in the back, each word tearing deeper into his resolve. He kept his gaze fixed forward, refusing to let them see the cracks forming in his armor. But inside the storm raged, a maelstrom of anger, grief, and suffocating isolation. He had fought harder than anyone, yet here he was, stripped bare. In the solitude of the locker room, Michael sank onto the bench, burying his face in his hands. His coat hung limp in the locker, the white fabric now a cruel reminder of a dream slipping away. He thought of the years spent studying, the sacrifices, the battles against doubt and rejection. Every step had been a climb against gravity, and now with one decision they had dragged him back down the mountain. The humiliation was complete, not just professional but personal. They hadn't merely demoted him, they had erased him. And erasure was worse than failure. Tears threatened, but he swallowed them back, forcing himself to breathe. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Never let them see you break, Michael. They'll use it against you." He clenched his fists, pressing his nails into his palms until pain replaced despair. Yet even her words, once a shield, now felt hollow. He had been strong for so long, endured for so long, but strength had yielded only more humiliation. The system wasn't built for men like him to thrive. It was built for them to endure until they collapsed. And collapse felt dangerously close. As he left the hospital that night, the city lights blurred through his weary eyes. Cars honked, people laughed, the world spun indifferently. He walked alone, his coat trailing behind him like a flag of defeat. He had given his all, fought through prejudice, carried lives in his hands, and still they had stripped him of dignity. The injustice burned like acid in his veins, but beneath the rage was something darker: hopelessness. If saving their lives wasn't enough to change their view, whatever would be? The question haunted him, echoing in the night like a curse. The announcement of Michael's reassignment spread through the hospital like wildfire, whispered from ward to ward, morphing into cruel jokes and smug comments. "Guess he wasn't ready for the big leagues," one intern said as Michael walked past. A nurse smirked, whispering, "He's better suited for paperwork than patients." Each remark hit like a lash, carving fresh wounds into scars that had never healed. Michael forced his face into neutrality, his steps measured, but inside the storm swelled. They weren't just questioning his competence, they were erasing his very identity as a doctor. Days later, the tension erupted during morning rounds. Michael, still temporarily allowed to shadow clinical work, entered a patient's room with Harris and a group of interns. The patient, an older businessman, frowned as soon as he saw Michael. "I don't want him touching me," the man barked, pointing directly at him. The interns exchanged glances, some hiding smirks. Harris cleared his throat, his lips curling into that familiar condescending smile. "Don't worry, sir, Dr. Carter is just observing today. You're in good hands with me." The words were casual, but the humiliation was deliberate, slicing Michael's pride open in front of everyone. Michael's face flushed, his chest tightening as whispers spread among the interns. They looked at him not with respect but with pity. One of them, a young man named Ryan, muttered under his breath, "Guess patients know best." Laughter flickered in the room like sparks. Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react, but the weight of their eyes pressed on him, suffocating. He wasn't just excluded, he was publicly invalidated, diminished into nothing more than a shadow in a white coat. His years of sacrifice reduced to ashes in a single humiliating exchange. After rounds, Michael sat alone in the break room, staring at his trembling hands. His chest burned with rage, but what hurt most was the silence of those around him. Not one intern spoke in his defense. Not one colleague challenged Harris's words. Even Patel, who had witnessed his brilliance during the crisis, walked past without acknowledgement. The loneliness was unbearable. It wasn't just the humiliation of one patient's prejudice. It was the confirmation that the system itself would never shield him. He was alone in this fight, surrounded by walls that closed tighter with every breath. The breaking point came during a Grand Rounds presentation later that week. Michael had spent nights preparing data on trauma interventions, determined to prove his worth academically, if not clinically. As he stood at the podium, his slides glowing behind him, the room filled with doctors and administrators. His voice was steady, his points sharp, his evidence undeniable. But halfway through, Harris interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Thank you, Dr. Carter, that will be all. Let's move on to something more relevant." Murmurs rippled through the audience, some snickering, others nodding in agreement. Michael froze, the words choking in his throat. He tried to protest, "With respect, Dr. Harris, the data demonstrates—" But Harris cut him off sharply. "That's enough. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but theory and practice are very different. You're still learning." The dismissal was brutal, absolute. The room erupted in soft laughter, the kind that corrodes from the inside out. Michael stood frozen, his presentation abandoned, his dignity shredded before his peers. The humiliation was complete. He had been silenced, invalidated, erased in front of the very people he had hoped to inspire. The sting was unbearable, but the wound cut deeper than pride. It carved into his very soul. As the meeting ended, colleagues filed out, whispering, chuckling, some throwing him pitying glances. "Don't take it personally," one intern said with a smirk. "Happens to all of us, but it didn't happen to all of them. It happened to him. Repeatedly, consistently. Because of the color of his skin, his presence was never neutral. It was always questioned, always undermined." He packed his notes with trembling hands, his vision blurred with unshed tears. He wanted to disappear, to vanish from this place that stripped him of dignity piece by piece. But he couldn't leave, not yet. That night, in the solitude of his apartment, the weight of the humiliation crushed him. He stared at the notes scattered on the table, his reflection fractured in the dark window. He whispered to himself, "Why do I keep fighting?" His voice cracked, heavy with despair. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, of the boy who once dreamed of healing, of the man who had sworn an oath. But the dream felt poisoned now, tainted by a system that refused to see him. The oath bound him to save lives, but who would save his spirit from breaking? Michael reached for his phone, scrolling through messages that weren't there. No one checked on him. No one encouraged him. The silence screamed louder than words ever could. He closed his eyes, inhaling sharply, fighting back tears. He wanted to believe that his work mattered, that his place here was earned. But every day, the evidence told a different story. Every day, the walls of prejudice grew taller, trapping him in a cage of invisibility. The despair clawed at him, threatening to consume what little strength remained. For the first time, he doubted whether he could endure. The following morning, as he walked into the hospital, whispers trailed behind him. "That's the one who got shut down during grand rounds." They're sidelining him now. Maybe he should stick to paperwork. Each comment was a nail in the coffin of his spirit. He kept walking, his expression stone, but inside he was breaking. The humiliation wasn't just professional, it was personal, eating away at his identity, his confidence, his hope. He wasn't just losing battles, he was losing himself. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The climax of his suffering came when he passed by Harris in the corridor. Harris, surrounded by interns, spotted him and smirked. "Careful, Carter," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "You might improvise your way into another disaster." The interns erupted in laughter, their eyes darting to Michael, waiting for a reaction. Michael froze, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He wanted to shout, to strike back, to unleash every ounce of pain bottled inside. But he stood silent, his dignity held hostage by restraint. The humiliation was public, merciless, unforgettable. As the laughter echoed down the hall, Michael walked away, each step heavy, each breath burning. He had faced death and chaos with unshakable strength, yet here, in the halls of his own hospital, he was broken. The climax of his suffering wasn't in the ER, where lives hung by threads. It was here, where prejudice tore him apart, where injustice silenced his worth. The storm inside him raged, threatening to consume him whole. But deep beneath the pain, a spark flickered, a spark that whispered, "This isn't the end. They will see. One day they will see." It happened on a Tuesday morning, just as the hospital settled into its usual rhythm. The cafeteria buzzed with chatter, the wards hummed with the sound of monitors, and the air was thick with routine. Michael walked through the corridor, his head lowered, his spirit heavy, when the overhead speakers blared, "Code Blue, Operating Room 3, Code Blue." The words echoed like a gunshot. Nurses rushed, doctors scattered, the air thick with panic. Something had gone terribly wrong. Michael froze for a second, then moved instinctively toward the chaos. Inside the OR, the scene was dire. Dr. Harris was on the table, his body convulsing, his face pale as death. He had returned to surgery too soon after his accident, ignoring medical advice, and now his heart was failing. The irony was cruel. The man who had humiliated Michael was now dying under the same roof, his arrogance collapsing into fragility. Around the table, senior doctors scrambled, their voices frantic. "We're losing him," one shouted. "Prepare the crash cart." Another fumbled with instruments, their panic spreading like wildfire. The room was drowning in chaos. Michael stood at the door, his chest tight, torn between rage and duty. He remembered Harris's smirk, his cruel words, the laughter that had burned him alive. For a heartbeat, he considered walking away, letting the man face the consequences of his arrogance. But then his oath echoed in his mind. Do no harm. His mother's voice whispered too. Never let them decide who you are. Show them who you are. His fists unclenched. He stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice steady. Move, I know what to do. The room fell silent in shock. Dr. Patel turned, his face pale with hesitation. Carter, this isn't your case. Michael's eyes locked onto him, unflinching. It is now or he dies. The authority in his tone left no room for doubt. Reluctantly, Patel stepped aside, the team's panic giving way to desperate obedience. Michael snapped on gloves, his movements precise, his focus unshakable. His hands moved with certainty, performing maneuvers the others hadn't considered. He saw what they didn't. He remembered what they forgot. He wasn't improvising. He was executing knowledge carved from years of relentless study and practice. The monitors screamed as Harris's heart faltered, flatlining for a second. Gasps filled the room, fear clawing at every throat. Michael leaned in, his voice sharp and commanding. Charge to 200, clear. The shock jolted Harris's body, but the line stayed flat. Sweat dripped from Michael's brow, his jaw tight. Again, charge to 300, clear. Another jolt, another silence. For a moment, despair clawed at him. Then faintly the beeping returned, weak, irregular, but alive. The room exhaled collectively, eyes wide with disbelief. Harris had been pulled back from the brink, and it was Michael who had done it. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Nurses stared at him with wide eyes, interns frozen in awe. Patel's lips parted as though words had abandoned him. Claire, watching from the observation deck, pressed her hand to the glass, her face pale with shock. The man they had ridiculed, mocked, humiliated. He had just saved Harris's life for the second time. And this time it wasn't in chaos. It was in front of everyone. The truth could no longer be buried beneath whispers. But then he remembered his mother's words. Justice is not revenge. Justice is truth. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in dignity. If he chose to help them, it would not be for their sake. It would be for the sake of the law, for the sake of proving that he could not be broken. When court resumed, Michael stood tall, his voice steady and commanding. Every spectator leaned in, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, but listening intently. He dismantled the fraudulent claims piece by piece, exposing lies with precision and clarity. Each sentence struck with the weight of truth, leaving Richard Hale pale and trembling. The judge, who once dismissed him, now regarded him with respect, even admiration. The Harringtons sat in silence, their faces masks of shame as the man they had ridiculed became their savior. Michael did not gloat, did not smile, did not taunt. His strength came not from humiliating them, but from proving his worth beyond doubt. The courtroom had shifted. Michael no longer begged for a place, he had claimed it. Richard Hale tried one last desperate objection, his voice faltering. Your Honor, Mr. Carter is dramatizing. But the judge cut him off sharply. Enough, Mr. Hale, Mr. Carter has the floor. The courtroom gasped, the balance of power permanently altered. Michael pressed on, his arguments clear, concise, undeniable. With every word, the Harringtons' defense became less about wealth and more about survival. Edward's face burned crimson with shame, his arrogance stripped away while Catherine bowed her head in silence. Michael had done what no one believed he could. He turned the courtroom into his stage, not for theatrics, but for truth. His humiliation had been transformed into triumph. The echoes of laughter were replaced by silence, reverence, and shock. By the end of the session, the evidence against the Harringtons had been discredited. The judge commended Michael's meticulous analysis, acknowledging him publicly for his expertise. The gallery, once filled with jeers, erupted in applause, a sound that washed over Michael like cleansing rain. He stood still, his heart swelling not with pride but with vindication. The very people who had doubted him now celebrated his brilliance. Richard Hale avoided his gaze entirely, his reputation shattered. The Harringtons sat stiff, their wealth unable to shield them from the sting of humility. For Michael, the victory was not just legal, it was moral. He had shown the world that no amount of prejudice could erase the truth. The courtroom belonged to justice, and justice had found its voice in him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Michael, microphones thrust forward eagerly. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be the man who saved the Harringtons?" one asked. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "This was never about saving the Harringtons," he said firmly. "It was about saving the truth. Justice is not selective. It does not belong to the wealthy or the powerful. It belongs to everyone." His words struck like thunder, echoing through the crowd of journalists and spectators. For the first time, they did not mock or dismiss him. They wrote his words down, eager to share them with the world. Michael walked away, the cameras flashing, but his mind already on something bigger than headlines. His fight was not for applause, it was for change. Later that evening, the Harringtons visited him one final time, their arrogance fully stripped away. Catherine spoke softly, her voice devoid of pride. "We owe you our reputation, Mr. Carter. You have our gratitude." Edward remained silent, his eyes burning with a mix of shame and resentment. Michael listened but did not smile. "You don't owe me gratitude," he replied. "You owe respect. To every person you dismissed, to every voice you silenced. That is the real debt." Catherine lowered her eyes, unable to argue. Michael turned away, signaling the conversation was over. For him, their words meant little. Gratitude without change was hollow, and he refused to be pacified by hollow gestures. His dignity was not for sale, not even to the richest family in the city. That night, Michael returned to his neighborhood, greeted by familiar faces and warm smiles. Children ran to him, shouting his name, their eyes filled with admiration. To them, he was not just a lawyer. He was proof that dreams could defy barriers. His neighbors embraced him, proud that one of their own had stood tall against the powerful. Michael felt a lump in his throat as he looked around, realizing this was his true victory. Not the applause of strangers, not the reluctant gratitude of the Harringtons, but the hope he had ignited in the hearts of his community. For every insult, every humiliation, every attempt to silence him, this moment was the answer. His fight had always been for them. As he sat with friends and family that evening, Michael reflected on the journey. He remembered the jeers, the laughter, the doubt that had nearly broken him. But he also remembered the fire that had kept him standing, the promise to his parents, the belief that truth mattered. Dignity, he thought, is not given by the world. It is claimed. His eyes glistened as he realized the magnitude of what he had achieved. He had not only defended a family who despised him, he had defended the very principle of equality, and in doing so, he had rewritten the story that so many had tried to write for him. He was no longer the underestimated lawyer. He was Michael Carter, the man who refused to be erased. The next morning, newspapers carried his name across their front pages. Underdog lawyer turns trial upside down. Michael Carter, from mockery to mastery. The world that had laughed at him now celebrated him. Yet Michael remained grounded, walking through the streets of his neighborhood with the same humility as before. He knew the battle against prejudice was far from over, but he also knew he had carved a crack in the wall of injustice, a crack wide enough for others to push through. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to every person told they did not belong. And in that knowledge, Michael found peace. In the quiet of his apartment that night, Michael wrote in his journal, the words flowing like a final verdict. They mocked me, silenced me, humiliated me. But in the end, they needed me. That is the power of truth. It outlasts arrogance, it outshines prejudice, it outlives hate. He closed the notebook, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new trials, new insults perhaps. But Michael Carter knew one unshakable truth. He would never again be underestimated. For he had stood in the fire of humiliation and emerged unburned, carrying the torch of justice for all to see.